What is going on, YouTube? Welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be working on the E36 and we're going to be doing one of the larger jobs that you can really do to an E36 besides obviously doing an engine swap. We're going to be dropping the entire rear subframe and replacing just about every bushing and doing a bunch of chassis reinforcements as well. As you can see in front of us, we've got pretty much the whole catalog from Condor Speed Shop. I gave them a call and they basically said this is the kind of stuff that I'm going to want to get. So we'll start with talking about some of the bushings. So we've got our complete rear subframe bushings. They're basically 4 total. They come in halves. To follow that up, we've got the rear differential bushing kit. These are going to be the 2 for the kind of the rear ears of the differential cover. And then this is going to be the front one, but we decided to do the 14mm bolt upgrade so that we get full thread engagement with our differential. And talking about the suspension, I decided to go with their monoball rear trailing arm bushings. These are going to help kind of keep that rear trailing arm nice and centered when it is with having full travel of the suspension. And then just to throw in a little extra thing, I decided to go with some transmission bushings. These things were super affordable, and since I was already ordering a big cart of things, I figured might as well save on shipping and add those to the cart. Now in front we have all of our reinforcement plates. We've got our 4 subframe reinforcement plates. We've got our trailing arm reinforcements, and then we have the rear sway bar reinforcement as well. So all these are going to get welded on. We're going to paint them as well, and I'll show you guys that process along the way. We are missing a couple things here. I wanted to get started on tearing apart the car and showing you guys that process since we're going to be waiting a few more days for the other bushings. So we are missing the 4 bushings for the rear control arm and the rear camber arms. Those are going to be the 4 outside ones. I did order new ones as well for the inside that are also monoball from Rogue Engineering, but as you can see, those are not here yet as well. I'll be sure to throw a link down in the description below for you guys to find all these products here that I'm going to be using today. With that being said, let's get started on the teardown. And if it's not obvious enough, car needs to be up in the air, wheels off. It's just easier if you take them all off. Gives you a little bit more space to work underneath the car. But now, first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to remove the exhaust. So we're just going to move it from basically the Y-pipe portion, which is the farthest forward section, back. And we're going to take this thing off, get it out of the way, because this is going to be the last thing to go back on. And this does come apart in about 2 sections. So we'll have the catback portion, and then we'll have the mid-pipe section to take off. And after some obvious challenges at the front, we remove the X-brace so that we have access to the header to Y-pipe bolts. We're able to break those loose and get those off. Now that the front is basically fully taken apart, we're going to work our way back. And now we can start taking apart the exhaust hangers in the middle. And we're going to try to take this thing off actually as like a whole unit and just drop it down on the ground. So we're going to take off those hangers in the center, and then we'll take off the rear hangers as well. And that should basically allow the exhaust to fall. Okay. There it goes. And now we just got to get the rear. Boom. And as you can see, pretty obvious, you have to take off the O2 sensors that are back there. But now that the exhaust is dropped, way easier to do that. The next step, we're going to want to take the rotor and caliper off. But when we do that, the caliper is going to want to hang, and it's going to put a lot of tension on that brake line, which is something we don't want to do. So the objective would be to pass it through the axle and this lower camber arm or control arm, but there's not enough space here to do that. So once we take off that caliper, get the rotor off, we're going to want to take off this lower camber arm so we can lower it, get the caliper back, and zip tie it up to the rear trailing arm. And now we have the caliper and the rotor completely off. Now we should be able to slide this lower control arm bolt. We now are able to completely lower this and create some space. I'm going to loosen up those back ones as well so this doesn't have so much tension on it. But at that point, now you can remove your rear shock, which is going to cause the entire left side to completely drop. So it's good to have some wood here stabilized so it can catch this rear basically section so it doesn't fall all the way to the ground. So unfortunately the camera stopped recording, but basically by removing the rear shock, you can, with the rotor off, you're then able to take out the lower bolt for the control arm, which allows us to have complete movement, and you're able to move the caliper underneath, around from the lower shock and through the lower control arm and the axle, so you can get the brake line kind of out of the way, which will allow us to travel a lot easier and not put any stress on that brake line. At this point, then you can remove the clip that's holding the brake line on, which mounts to that rear trailing arm, and take that bracket off. And so here are the two little tiny bolts that you can take out, which holds both brake lines to that rear trailing arm, which we're going to want to completely disconnect. This will allow us to get the caliper and brake lines completely out of the way when we remove the rest of these rear suspension components. And now that since this is all the way down, we can go ahead and take our spring out, since that's just hanging out, and we can remove the rest of the shock by disconnecting it from inside the trunk. So we're starting to get close to taking the rear subframe out. The next step to do is we're going to actually hop in the car, and we needed to disconnect the e-brake cables because they run to each side and actually run kind of through the whole car underneath. So we're going to have to pull them all the way out and through so that we can drop this subframe and not have those wires kind of tangled up. In order to do this, we need to get inside the car, take off the cover for the e-brake, and this whole thing just kind of pops off. And then once you look down below, you can see there's two nuts and some studs that kind of pop through, one on each side, controlling obviously the passenger side, and then this one's the driver's side. You're going to take those off so that the cable can pull all the way through. Now before we can even drop the subframe, we have to remember that there's a bunch of wires that run through this whole thing. So each side we have a wheel speed sensor, so the easiest way I think is going to be to disconnect the actual connection point up here by the differential, and then we can just leave the wheel speed sensor attached when we go to drop this whole thing, and basically just make sure all of these connections aren't going to be caught up when we go to lower this thing. So now we can start working towards taking the differential out. Because we're going to want to remove all the basically the axles in the back, we don't want to disconnect the drive line just yet because we want to be able to put it in gear so it locks when we go to break all the E12 bolts loose on each side. So what we'll do is basically break the two that we have access to, take it out of gear, put it in neutral so we can rotate both sides, and then put it back in gear, and basically just repeat this process till they're all broken loose. And then we can go ahead and actually disconnect the drive line, which is towards the front of the differential. And after that, we can take those axles out, and we should be able to drop the differential at that point. So now that all of the bolts that hold the axle to the differential, those are all loosened up a little bit, just about finger tight. Now we can go ahead and disconnect the drive line from the front. I've already used some WD-40 to kind of help break those loose a little bit, kind of help out. But we're just going to take a 16 mil now and try to break these loose. These things are going to be on super tight. So if you have a bigger wrench than this, I recommend using it. Oh, those come off way easier now that I put the WD-40 on there. We are going to have to spin this thing to get to the top ones. So taking it out of gear and kind of just rotating it by hand will help us get there. I ran into a little problem here. When I was trying to remove the axles after disconnecting those bolts and trying to pull them out at kind of the connection point where the flange goes into the diff, the problem that I'm having is when I go to pull the axle out, and it's supposed to separate right here. So when I go to pull this apart, it actually pulls the entire flange out of the differential all the way back here, and you can basically see inside of it. Obviously I do have some leaking, as you can tell. It's pretty gunked up here, and there's some fluid that's been built around. So I think
maybe the seals are bad, causing it to kind of pull out there versus just separating right here. Because I don't want to cause any damage or risk leaking fluid everywhere, what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop the entire subframe with the differential mounted to it as one whole unit, in which case we're going to skip this step and we're going to go ahead and basically support the subframe here and here using some wood to kind of stabilize it, and go straight into disconnecting the 3 bolts on each side that hold the trailing arm, which is going to cause this entire thing to drop. So I'm going to want to maybe stabilize this as I loosen each side, and then I'll take a giant transmission jack that I have and place it underneath this whole thing and start loosening these 4 subframe bolts. So now I'm removing this trailing arm. This thing's going to want to drop because the only thing holding this whole side in is basically these 3 bolts. Basically at this point, just the jack is holding up the whole rear end. So I'm going to slowly lower it and get it off the studs that are in the front, and hopefully this thing comes out smoothly. So you can see kind of the setup I have going on. I have a piece of wood here towards the back, but I don't have anything supporting the actual subframe, so when this thing completely drops, it's going to tilt forward. We're pretty much off of the front studs, which is where we were bound up initially. So I'm going to have to get a small little piece of wood to put under there so it doesn't actually fall forward.
So finally got the rear end out. If you can't tell, I'm out of breath. This thing was really hard to get off just at the drive shaft input to the diff. You can see we're leaking a bunch of fluid or grease here. This connection had rusted so much to those studs that actually passed through with those nuts on the back that we took off, that no matter if I lowered or wiggled the basically rear subframe here, it would not break loose. So what I ended up having to do is get a bunch of PB Blaster or WD-40 and ended up prying the bolts from the backside to get enough leverage to push them out. Once I did that, I was able to kind of fit the pry bar in between the joint here and kind of spread it and turn the axle here so that I could get more access to the different areas. Once I had that broken loose, I was able to completely lower the subframe. I actually lowered it on these wheel dollies on each side so that the whole thing can basically slide as one unit, and it makes it way easier to move this thing around, as you can see. Now that I have this whole thing out, I'm going to call it for today because the next day is basically going to be tearing this thing apart, taking every single thing off this subframe. And basically that is going to be it for the video, the part 1 here. This is probably going to be about a 3-part series, I would say. One part kind of just getting this thing out, as you can tell from this episode here. Next episode, we're going to be taking all the suspension components apart, taking off the old bushings and putting on the new ones, and hopefully trying to see if we can either get these powder coated or spray paint all these basically control arms and the subframe, because you can see there are some spots that have a little bit of surface rust here, as well as these things are just super gunked up. So I'm going to hit everything with a pressure washer and try to get a lot of this like grease that's built up over the past 180,000 miles that this car's been on the road. That's basically it for this video. Comment down below if you guys have any questions for how to get your rear diff out and rear subframe out. Overall, I wouldn't say it's the hardest thing to do. It's really just some basic tools, but it's really just having that dedication and taking things slowly and being very organized when you take bolts off, so that way you know where they go. But that's it for the video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all on the next one.